Once upon a time, the very name Burkina Faso was spoken with pity. People thought only of hunger dust and endless dependency. But today, that same name carries a different weight. It echoes in ministries, in boardrooms, and even across oceans because a deal worth $2.6 billion has been signed. Not aid, not loans, but a partnership that could rewrite not just an economy, but the dignity of an entire nation. Picture this: a farmer bends over his field on a dusty road, his radio crackling with the news. For decades, his harvest barely kept his family alive. Now he hears that his country has signed an agreement bigger than anything he ever imagined. He looks at his children and wonders, will this number bring shoes for school, medicine for the sick, and roads that actually reach his village, or will it fade away like so many promises before? At the center of this story is a young soldier turned statesman, President Ibrahim Traoré. He does not speak of charity. He does not bow his head in gratitude. Instead, he speaks of equality. One brings the land, the other brings the market. Together, we build dignity. Those words are not just about soybeans, factories, or roads. They are about sovereignty itself, the right of a people to stand as equals, not beggars. But here's the question that lingers: can a landlocked country of 23 million farmers truly carry the weight of such a promise? Can billions on paper become bread on the table? Or will history repeat itself, leaving only disappointment in its wake? Stay with us, because this is more than contracts and crops. This is a glimpse of Africa rewriting her name. And if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, subscribe, share, and lend your voice, because silence too is a choice. In late 2023, with little fanfare but with enormous consequence, Burkina Faso announced a 10-year agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia valued at $2.6 billion. For a nation of just 23 million people, long known for exporting raw cotton, a little livestock, and very little else, this number was not only historic, it was a declaration that the rules had changed. The agreement was not a one-time check, not a lump sum of aid that would vanish into foreign banks. Instead, it was structured as a long-term investment plan, carefully divided into pillars meant to transform the economy piece by piece. 30%, almost a third, was dedicated to infrastructure. For decades, farmers watched their crops rot under the burning sun because there were no silos to store them. Roads were broken, clogged, or simply non-existent, trapping goods in villages while traders in cities set the prices. Under this deal, silos would rise, highways would stretch from Ouagadougou to the borders, and for the first time, a railway was proposed to connect the landlocked heart of Burkina Faso to the ports of Ghana. It was a dream spoken for decades, now written in ink. 25% was allocated to processing plants. Soybeans, long exported raw at low prices, would now be pressed into oil, turned into animal feed, even refined into biodiesel. For every ton processed locally, new jobs would be created and profits would remain in the villages where the beans were grown. The promise was simple: Burkina Faso would stop shipping away its wealth unfinished, only to buy it back later at 10 times the cost. 20% went to science and technology. In a land where farmers still lifted their eyes to the sky praying for rain, this portion meant hope. Drought-resistant seeds, new irrigation systems, and even drones to guide planting seasons, tools that could turn desperation into stability. For the first time, harvests would not depend only on prayer, but on planning. 15% was devoted to cooperatives and training. Women, who already made up nearly 40% of soybean farmers, would receive credit lines and technical support. Youth who once boarded buses south toward Accra or Lagos searching for work would instead be trained to manage machinery, to run cooperatives, and to turn soil into livelihood. This was not simply farming, it was nation building. The final 10% targeted finance and security. A national export bank was to be established to shield farmers from the brutal swings of global commodity prices. Insurance programs would protect against droughts and floods. Local security forces would safeguard villages, ensuring that what was grown could travel safely to markets without being stolen or destroyed. When these figures were revealed, skeptics abroad dismissed the plan as overambitious. But for many inside Burkina Faso, it felt less like fantasy and more like overdue justice. After all, the soil had already proven its strength. In 2019, the country produced about 51,000 tons of soybeans. By 2023, that figure had risen to 129,000 tons, an increase of nearly 150% in just 5 years. The land was fertile, the farmers capable. What had been missing was investment, vision, and trust. For Saudi Arabia, the logic was equally clear. In the desert kingdom where water is scarce, soybeans are not just crops but lifelines. They are vital for animal feed, for cooking oil, and increasingly for biodiesel as the country seeks cleaner energy. By securing a reliable partner in the Sahel, Riyadh ensured its food security, while Burkina Faso ensured its future. But what made this deal more than just economics was the language of President Ibrahim Traoré. He did not call it charity. He did not thank donors for their kindness. Instead, he declared, "One brings the land, the other brings the market. Together we build dignity." It was a deliberate rejection of the vocabulary of dependency that had shackled Africa for generations. No loans, no handouts, partnership. Still, for ordinary people, contracts signed in distant capitals could feel abstract. A farmer named Musa, near Bobo Dioulasso, heard the news on his crackling radio. He looked at his two children and wondered, would these billions mean shoes for school, or would it be another promise forgotten in the dust? That tension between hope and doubt lingered everywhere. What could not be denied, however, was that the stakes had changed. This was not about soybeans alone. It was about whether a small, landlocked country could finally claim its seat at the global trading table, not as a beggar, but as an equal. The announcement of the $2.6 billion deal did not stay confined to government halls. It traveled like fire across dry grass, through dusty markets, over village radios, and into the crowded buses of Ouagadougou. Reactions were immediate, passionate, and divided. In the town of Bobo Dioulasso, Musa the farmer stopped working when he heard the crackling broadcast. He set down his hoe, looked at his children, and asked himself if their future had just shifted. Would these billions bring medicine when they were sick? Would they one day walk to a proper school in shoes he could afford? Hope pressed against years of doubt. Far away in Ouagadougou, a taxi driver tightened his grip on the steering wheel when the news came over his dashboard radio. "We have heard promises before," he muttered. For him, big numbers meant little unless they translated into lower fuel prices and affordable school fees. His skepticism spoke for many who had seen too many grand projects fade into silence. Yet under a tin roof in Koudougou, the mood was very different. 30 women farmers gathered in their cooperative led by Mariam, who lifted her voice above the chatter. "They are not only buying our beans," she said. "They are building our presses, our roads, our schools." Her words ignited ululation, those piercing cries of joy that African women release when hope feels real. For the first time, they believed their sweat in the fields might translate into leadership and prosperity. On university steps, students debated fiercely. Some hailed Traoré as a visionary who dared to gamble boldly for the nation's dignity. "If they call him reckless," one declared, "then let him be reckless for freedom." Others, wary of history, countered that contracts had failed Burkina before leaving only disappointment. These debates captured the national mood, a mix of pride, fear, and restless anticipation. The ripples spread beyond borders. In Mali, farmers asked, "If Burkina can secure such a deal for soybeans, why not cattle for us?" In Niger, voices rose, "If they can sell beans, why not our rice?" The Sahel alliance, once seen only as a military pact, began to look like the seed of an economic community. Internationally, the reactions revealed even sharper contrasts. In Europe, newspapers wrote with surprise and unease. Commentators admitted, "We did not expect this pace, this scale." Some worried aloud about the fate of the CFA franc if Sahel nations began bypassing Paris and Brussels with direct deals. In Asia, the tone was different. Chinese observers quietly studied Burkina's cooperatives, considering future investment. In New Delhi, Indian editors saw the agreement as a symbol of South-South trade, a model that could bypass the West entirely. Even Brazil, a giant in soybean production, tipped its hat, offering technical cooperation rather than rivalry. But in Washington and Paris, silence carried tension. Official statements were absent, but think tanks filled the void. Reports spoke of instability, risk, and uncertainty. Yet beneath those polite words was a deeper fear that Africa was no longer waiting for permission. Through all these echoes, one phrase cut like a blade. When Africa kneels, they call it stability. When Africa stands, they call it instability. When Africa obeys, they speak of partnership. When Africa chooses freely, they whisper recklessness. These words circulating on social media and whispered in marketplaces captured the heart of the conflict. The climax was unmistakable. In one corner stood hope farmers dreaming of irrigation, women imagining leadership, youth envisioning factories and jobs. In the other stood doubt, memories of corruption, scars of abandoned projects, fear that billions could vanish before touching the poor. Internationally, praise collided with suspicion, admiration with envy, encouragement with warnings. For some, this deal proved that even a small landlocked nation could alter the global balance. For others, it was a dangerous gamble. But one fact could not be denied: Burkina Faso was no longer invisible. The world had to watch. The region had to respond. And the people themselves had to decide whether to believe. For decades, the state in Burkina Faso was viewed with suspicion. Too many promises had been made and broken. Too many projects had begun with fanfare only to end in silence. But when the $2.6 billion agreement began to filter into daily life, something unexpected happened. Trust long buried started to rise again. In villages once defined by survival, visible change appeared. Silos rose above the horizon, standing like monuments against waste. Roads that had been little more than dusty tracks were paved, shortening the endless hours farmers once spent carrying crops to market. For the first time in memory, infrastructure felt like a gift, not for the elite, but for the ordinary. Factories, too, began to hum. In towns where youth once polished passports to leave for Lagos or Accra, they now polished machinery in soybean processing plants. What was once a pipeline of migration slowly turned into a pipeline of employment. The exodus slowed. Families who once sent sons and daughters away now imagined a future at home. For women, the transformation was profound. Long the backbone of agriculture but rarely recognized, they now stood at the forefront of cooperatives. Credit lines allowed them to buy equipment, irrigation tools, and even trucks. Fatimata, a mother of 5, once prayed only for rain. With irrigation pipes in her fields, she prayed instead for strength to manage her growing cooperative. When women rise, the nation rises, read the banner at a regional gathering, and this time the words felt true. Education followed. Training centers opened, offering lessons in agronomy, mechanics, and logistics. In classrooms with cracked walls and worn benches, students now studied with a sense of purpose. For the first time, there was a clear line between the textbooks in their hands and the jobs waiting outside their doors. But the consequences were not only social. Politically, the shift was seismic. Ibrahim Traoré did not lock himself behind palace gates. He was seen eating porridge under baobab trees, listening to elders sitting cross-legged on mats with farmers. His message was not delivered from distant podiums, but through shared meals and simple words: "Your hands are the strength of Burkina. Your fields are the nation's wealth." That visibility changed perceptions. Even critics began to admit that perhaps this government was not simply ruling, but partnering. Legitimacy was no longer a theory, it was being rebuilt, step by step, on dusty roads and in village meetings. Yet alongside hope grew vigilance. Citizens burned by history demanded transparency. Committees formed to monitor projects. Farmers asked hard questions about contracts, about who would truly benefit, about whether the billions would stay in the soil or vanish into hidden accounts. The people were not passive beneficiaries, they were becoming guardians of the covenant. The double edge of the deal became clear. On one side stood empowerment jobs, created women rising, youth returning, trust rebuilt. On the other side loomed risk, corruption, exhaustion, and betrayal if vigilance faltered. What had begun as a contract now became something larger, a test of whether Burkina Faso could anchor its sovereignty in the daily bread of its people, a test of whether politics could be less about decrees and more about kinship. For the first time in a generation, the people of Burkina Faso felt they were not merely surviving history, but shaping it. And in that fragile but powerful shift lay the foundation of a new civil and political awakening. On the global stage, the $2.6 billion agreement landed like a thunderclap. It was not just a deal between Ouagadougou and Riyadh, it was a signal that Africa could negotiate on its own terms. And for Washington, Paris, and Brussels, that signal was deeply unsettling. In the United States, officials offered no public statements, but think tanks quickly filled the silence. Reports described the deal as risky and warned of regional instability. Yet beneath the diplomatic language was a more fundamental fear that one small African nation had just shown others how to step outside the corridors of the IMF and World Bank. For decades, American influence had flowed through those institutions, shaping Africa's economic story. If Burkina Faso could bypass them, what would stop Mali, Niger, or even Ghana from doing the same across the Atlantic? France felt the tremor even more sharply. Once the colonial master of Burkina Faso, Paris had long maintained influence through the CFA franc and economic dependence. French editors asked aloud whether the old monetary system could survive if the Sahel began trading freely with new partners. Some newspapers muttered about recklessness, others about dictatorship. The louder the criticism grew, the more obvious it became that Europe was anxious about losing its grip. By contrast, in the global south, the mood was one of admiration. In New Delhi, commentators hailed the agreement as proof that South-South trade could become the backbone of a new economic order. In Beijing, observers studied Burkina's cooperatives closely, weighing opportunities for deeper investment. In Brasilia, soybean giants extended a rare gesture of respect, offering technical cooperation rather than competition. For much of Asia and Latin America, the deal was not a threat, it was inspiration. Saudi Arabia, of course, framed the agreement as a partnership of equals, a desert kingdom securing food security, a Sahel nation securing dignity. The symbolism was powerful. No longer was Africa spoken of only in terms of aid. It was seen as a reliable partner in the global supply chain. Even in the African diaspora, the echoes were profound. Among African-American elders, memories stirred of marches where signs declared, "I am a man," and Martin Luther King Jr. warned that freedom delayed is freedom denied. To them, Burkina Faso's deal was not only about soybeans, it was about dignity, reclaimed a younger generation echoing the old cry, "We will not wait for permission." The contrast was stark. When Africa kneels, Western powers call it stability. When Africa stands, they call it instability. When Africa obeys, they speak of partnership. When Africa chooses freely, they whisper recklessness. This irony was not lost on those watching from around the world. What became undeniable was this: Burkina Faso had made itself visible. No longer could it be ignored as a landlocked country of dust and aid. It was now a case study in sovereignty, a challenge to the old order, and a beacon for nations still searching for their own path. The question was no longer whether the world would notice, but how it would respond. For too long, Burkina Faso's name was written in the world's ledger only as a story of hunger and aid. Its fields were described as barren, its people as dependent, its future as borrowed. That injustice cut deep not only in Burkina Faso but across the entire African continent. Now, with the stroke of a pen and the covenant of $2.6 billion, the nation dares to rewrite that story. Silos rise, factories stir, women lead, and young men who once dreamed of exile now dream of staying. These are not just economic developments. They are the seeds of sovereignty planted in soil that has known both despair and resilience. Yet history warns us, Africa has seen too many promises collapse into ruins, too many funds siphoned into hidden accounts, too many grand projects turned into empty shells. The risk is real that this deal could join the graveyard of broken dreams. The ink is dry, but ink alone never feeds a child. It is only vigilance, honesty, and collective will that can transform numbers on paper into bread on the table. And so the burden does not fall only on leaders. It falls on the people of Burkina Faso themselves, farmers, women, youth, elders, who must guard this covenant like they guard their harvest. It falls too on us who watch from abroad. For if Burkina Faso succeeds, it sends a message far beyond its borders that Africa can stand on its own terms, that sovereignty is not charity, and that dignity delayed is dignity denied. But if it fails, the old whispers will return. Africa cannot manage itself. Africa cannot be trusted. That is why this story is larger than soybeans, larger than trade. It is about whether a small landlocked nation can chart a course that reshapes the balance of the world. So I ask you, do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies are strong enough to turn contracts into dignity, or will history repeat itself? Can Burkina Faso be the spark of a wider African awakening, or will it be another promise lost to dust? If your heart tells you this story matters, then do not remain silent. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. Because silence too is a choice. And the world must hear Africa's voice clear, proud, and unafraid.